In the autumn of 1842, an entire family disappeared from their plantation house in northern Louisiana. No fire, no forced entry, no bodies. Only one thing was left behind. A locked room where the wallpaper still dripped with blood, and a ledger with names that were never meant to be written down. The camera lingers on a faded photograph of the plantation gates, warped and cracked. A crow calls in the distance. This was the Albright estate, a place erased from parish records, its very name buried beneath deeds and burned documents. But stories survived, carried on in whispers of former slaves, sharecroppers, and churchmen who dared not speak too loudly. The story begins not with their disappearance, but with what was discovered hidden beneath the floorboards. The Albrights were not just landowners. They were something more. A family whose church ties ran deep into the marrow of Louisiana's oldest parishes. Reverend Thomas Albright was said to speak with a tongue of ash, his sermons dripping with fire and promise. But behind the pulpit, his home was a crypt of corruption. His daughter, Eleanor Albright, was a girl caught between shame and indulgence. Described in parish records as corpulent, pale, and brooding, Eleanor had no suitors. Her body was ridiculed, even by her own kin. But in the ledger found after the family's disappearance, her name was circled in ink, followed by a single word, given. Given to whom? Whispers among the enslaved spoke of a bargain. A night when Eleanor was offered to a man who was not a man at all, but something bound in chains beneath the estate. The ledger recorded every offering, every ritual masked as discipline. And from that night forward, Eleanor was no longer seen in daylight. The parish coroner's notes, smuggled from the courthouse before records were destroyed, describe a chamber below the Albright estate. A stone cistern, damp and foul-smelling, older than the plantation itself. Inside were bones, animal and human, fused with wax and ash. But it was not the bones that chilled investigators. It was the marks on the walls. Scratches, endless scratches, some in English, some in a tongue no one could name. Among them, a message believed to be Eleanor's. He eats and does not eat. He fills and empties. He takes my skin as his own. What did this mean? The coroner concluded the marks on the wall were made by someone with fingers worn down to raw cartilage. And when the floorboards were pried open, they found her body, or what was left of it. Eleanor's flesh had been peeled, layered onto a wooden frame like wet parchment. Her face had been hollowed, yet arranged with a grotesque smile, as though she were watching. The discovery was so disturbing that the sheriff who filed the report resigned the very next morning, leaving behind only 3 words on his desk. The hunger spreads. The Albright ledger was no simple record of debts. Its entries bore dates stretching back to 1807, nearly 40 years before Eleanor's death. Each entry listed the name of a child, a worker, or even a parishioner, followed by a single symbol, drawn in an ink the color of dried rust. A local historian, decades later, recognized the symbol as nearly identical to one found on French occult manuscripts, smuggled from Haiti during the failed slave uprisings. What had these documents been doing in the hands of an American pastor? The ledger did not tally crops, wages, or births. It documented sacrifices. And then, curiously, there were gaps. Entire years missing, pages torn out, and margins scorched by flame. The handwriting was not always the same. Sometimes neat, other times erratic, as if written by many hands or many voices. But one page chilled researchers most. Eleanor, given whole to preserve the hollow. The hollow. That word would surface again and again in surviving letters, songs, and oral tales. But no one could agree what it meant. Was it a place? A being? Or a hunger that had lived under Louisiana soil long before Europeans ever came? Why did no one speak? When the Albright estate collapsed into scandal, the town of St. Froid turned its back. Records from the First Baptist Church show that every man who investigated the estate either fled the parish, went mad, or died under uncertain circumstances. One preacher, Reverend John Millet, wrote in his final sermon, "The hollow is not their burden, but ours. It is our duty to feed it, lest it choose for itself." Weeks later, Millet's wife and 3 daughters were found drowned in their own well, their mouths filled with mud. No charges were filed. What frightened the community more than death was exposure. To admit what was happening in St. Froid would bring the gaze of state authorities, of northern abolitionists, of anyone who might tear open the soil. Better to hide it. Better to offer quietly than to be devoured loudly. So the town sang hymns, baptized their children, and prayed each Sunday, while beneath their shoes, something ancient feasted in silence. In 1863, during the chaos of the Civil War, Union soldiers briefly occupied St. Froid. Their diaries contain brief, curious notes about the locals. One soldier wrote, "The children sing as though they are not their own." He described strange nursery rhymes sung by young boys and girls, verses passed down like folk tunes. Hide the face, hide the skin, he will wear you from within. Feed the hollow, keep it near, or the hollow comes to hear. When officers pressed townsfolk about these songs, they were met with stone-faced silence. One mother claimed the lyrics were just old nonsense, but another soldier noticed her hands trembling violently as she said it. By the time Union forces withdrew, 5 soldiers had vanished. 2 from their beds, 1 from the mess tent, and 2 while on night patrol near the abandoned Albright fields. The disappearances were never investigated. The war swallowed everything, but the children kept singing. When the war ended in 1865, St. Froid should have been free of its chains. The plantation collapsed, the Albright name vanished, and Union forces left only ruins. But the ledger was not destroyed. It passed quietly into the hands of Reverend Samuel Durand, who had fled New Orleans during the war. Durand reopened the ruined estate grounds under a new name, the Hollow Fields Orphanage. On paper, it was a charity for the hundreds of children left homeless by war, famine, and yellow fever. In practice, it became a veil for something older. Children were taken in, but many were never adopted, never schooled, never seen again. Parish records of baptisms show dozens of new names, yet the town cemeteries contain no graves. A Union inspector reported in 1872 that the orphanage had a curious deficit of bodies relative to registered numbers. His report was filed, but 2 weeks later he was struck by a train outside Baton Rouge. Witnesses swore the tracks had been clear seconds before. Durand preached weekly in the church adjoining the orphanage. His sermons were filled with promises of redemption, of purification through surrender. Those who sat in the pews whispered later that his voice carried echoes not his own. A strange prayer emerged from the Hollow Fields Orphanage, a chant recited by children before sleep. It was recorded once by a Methodist minister visiting from Shreveport. He wrote it in his journal. "Beneath the ground we give our skin, so he may breathe, so he may win. Take the fat, take the bone, leave the shell to walk alone." When asked who taught them this prayer, the children all pointed upward, not to heaven, but to the rafters of their dormitory, where the beams were blackened with age. The minister left St. Froid that very night. His journal ends abruptly. "There are voices in the walls. They whisper through the hollow. I will not return." Years later, when investigators entered the abandoned dormitories, they found those rafters covered in tiny fingernail scratches, hundreds upon hundreds, climbing upward like a ladder no child could finish. By the 1890s, whispers of corruption at Hollow Fields reached the ear of the Southern Theological Seminary in Kentucky. But instead of shutting it down, the seminary sent a delegation of young clergymen to study the orphanage. Among their letters, those not burned, were accounts of rituals disguised as Sunday Mass. Children were dressed in white and paraded through the fields at night, singing in languages no priest could identify. One seminarian, Charles Wilcox, wrote to his fiancée, "It is not Christianity they practice here. It is something older, something that devours Christ and wears his face like a mask. I fear if I stay, I will become one of them." Wilcox returned to Kentucky in 1896, gaunt and unrecognizable. His fiancée described his skin as too loose, as though it belonged to another man. He refused food, saying the hollow had already fed him. He died in his sleep, his face torn away, leaving only a raw skull. The seminary covered it up. His death was ruled an illness of the nerves. And the Hollow Fields Orphanage continued. By the turn of the century, St. Froid was a town with two faces. By day, it bustled with trade, sugarcane, and river traffic. By night, the streets grew silent, doors barred, windows nailed shut. Between 1901 and 1908, 17 townsfolk vanished without a trace. Farmers, schoolteachers, even a sheriff's deputy. No bodies, no graves. Only personal belongings left behind in perfect order. Clothes folded on chairs, food set neatly at the table, beds still warm. Local legend claimed the missing had been called by the Hollow, lured into the fields under the moon. Neighbors swore they heard footsteps long after curfew, and scraping sounds beneath their floorboards, like nails clawing upward from the earth. In one diary, later recovered from the attic of a vanished schoolteacher, a final entry reads, "It is in my mouth. When I speak, I hear him. When I sleep, I feel him peeling me, pulling me. Tonight I will walk to the fields. I will not return." The Hollow didn't just consume children. It was hungry for all of them. In 1912, Father Augustine Renaud, a Jesuit priest from New Orleans, was sent to St. Froid under orders from the archdiocese. His mission: investigate the mounting rumors of cult practices at Hollow Fields Orphanage. Renaud was a scholar of apocryphal scripture, fluent in Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. What he found in the church archives horrified him. Hidden among baptism records and tithing logs were manuscripts bound in human leather, dating back to the early 1700s. The text spoke of the Hallowed One, a presence that does not eat flesh, but wears it. A being that survives through fat, bone, and skin offered willingly. The priests who fled Haiti during the uprisings had brought more than books, they had brought a covenant. Renaud's final letter, never sent, was discovered much later. This is not heresy. It is older than the church. They bury him in us, and we walk for him. The children are not orphans. They are vessels. The day after writing this, Renaud was found dead in the church sacristy. His body was intact, but his face was gone. By 1919, Hollow Fields Orphanage was a place of dread. Travelers avoided the roads near it. Mothers pulled their children indoors when the bell rang at dusk. That year, a fire consumed the orphanage in a single night. Witnesses swore the flames burned blue and green, as though the wood itself were alive. The cries of children were heard miles away. Yet when townsfolk finally dared to enter the ruins, they found no bodies. Not one. Only the rafters remained, still covered in claw marks. Officially, the orphanage was declared destroyed by accident, faulty lantern oil, but survivors spoke differently. They said the children had walked into the fire willingly, singing the Hollow song. After the blaze, the town sealed the grounds with iron gates and razed what was left. The land was left fallow, untouched, but strange reports continued. Lights at night, voices under the soil, livestock found skinned yet somehow still alive for days afterward. And then came the great silence. Families began to leave St. Froid in droves. By 1933, the town was nearly empty. The Hollow had been fed too long. By the 1930s, St. Froid was a skeleton of a town. Weeds overtook the streets, shutters banged on empty homes, and only a handful of families remained. Of those, only 3 children survived into adulthood, orphans once housed at Hollow Fields. Their names rarely appear in census records, and when they do, they are scratched out, as if erased by force. Yet fragments of testimony exist. One, taken by a WPA oral historian in 1937, captures the broken voice of Clara J. Her words trembled. "They said we was God's lambs, but we never saw no God. Only him, the Hollow. They cut us open, they fed him the soft parts. We walked with no breath, no eyes, but still we walked. I remember my skin on another girl's face. And I remember laughing, though I never wanted to." Clara disappeared 2 weeks after giving that testimony. The interviewer's notes end with one line. She smiled at the end. But it wasn't her smile. The 2 other survivors fared no better. one institutionalized in a Louisiana asylum, the other drowned in the Mississippi River with her arms folded as if in prayer. In 1942, amid the chaos of World War II, federal investigators briefly returned to the ruins of St. Froid. Officially, their task was to survey abandoned land for possible military use. Unofficially, they were chasing whispers carried by soldiers. Men returning from basic training in the South told of recruits who sang in strange tongues at night, recruits who could go days without eating yet never weakened. They said these men claimed to be children of the hollow. The government feared infiltration of cults, of foreign influence, of something worse. Files declassified decades later confirm that agents did visit the hollow field's grounds. What they found was redacted, but one memo survives. Do not disturb the soil. Containment preferable to excavation. The phenomenon is not limited to one site. Recommend silence. The ruins were fenced, sealed, and marked as government property. St. Froid was left to rot, a ghost town swallowed by cane fields. But secrecy could not erase memory. For those few who carried the hollow in their minds, memory itself became a form of possession. Survivors and witnesses described dreams where their bodies were not their own, where skin unzipped like a garment and something slipped inside. Psychiatrists in the 1940s recorded cases of dermal dissociation among Louisiana patients. They complained their flesh no longer belonged to them, that someone else was trying it on. Many clawed at themselves until their hands were bones. In Baton Rouge, a man named Henry L. was admitted after covering his walls with words written in blood. The hollow wears me. The hollow wears us all. He died in his cell with his face peeled from his skull, yet no tool was ever found. The asylum staff burned his room and sealed the records. But the nurses whispered that his body kept twitching for 3 days. The hollow was no longer a place. It had become a memory that ate. After the Second World War, America turned its gaze to prosperity. But hidden beneath the veneer of suburbs and highways, the government still feared the hollow. In 1947, the Army Corps of Engineers quietly surveyed abandoned land in northern Louisiana. St. Froid was flagged as unstable terrain. But internal memos later leaked showed something stranger. Maps with no topography, no rivers, no fields. Just blank space. Locals said surveyors went missing. Their vehicles were found idling by the roadside, headlights on, doors open. No footprints led away. Only a smear of fat across the driver's seat. Yellow, rancid, and cold. The Corps declared St. Froid unsafe and sealed the files under the guise of floodplain management. To this day, maps of the area are inconsistent. Sometimes the town is there, sometimes not at all. But memory has a way of clawing back. In 1951, a historian named Dr. Miriam Hale stumbled upon a trunk in the basement of Tulane University. Inside were photographs believed destroyed decades earlier, sepia images of the Hollowfields orphanage before its burning. The photographs were not ordinary. Children stared at the camera, but their faces were blurred, not by time, but by motion, as though their skin shifted during the exposure. One frame showed Eleanor Albright herself, gaunt and smiling, though parish records claimed she had died almost 70 years before the photograph was taken. Most disturbing was a final image. The orphanage chapel, its pews filled not with children, but with flayed skins propped upright like parishioners. Dr. Hale tried to publish her findings. Within months, she vanished. Her apartment was found locked from the inside, her typewriter ribbon ripped free. On the desk, one unfinished line. The hollow does not die. It waits in the fat of America. The trunk of photographs has never been found again. By 1953, St. Froid had become a legend whispered among occult scholars and amateur folklorists. A group of 3 researchers from Chicago traveled south to document the ruins. They brought tape recorders, cameras, and a determination to prove or disprove the myth. Their car was discovered weeks later at the edge of the cane fields. Inside were their belongings, untouched. The back seat was soaked in a pale, oily liquid that smelled of lard and bile. The tape recorder contained only one usable reel. On it, the researchers are heard laughing nervously, trudging through brush. Then silence. Then singing children's voices, faint and overlapping. Finally, a woman whispers close to the microphone. He wears you until you forget what you were. The reel ends in static. The three researchers were never seen again. Their families demanded answers, but state police dismissed the case as runaways. The files were sealed, and Saint Froid disappeared once more into silence. Though Saint Froid vanished from maps, it never vanished from memory. By the 1960s, the story had trickled into counterculture circles. Poets, occultists, and musicians whispered about the town that fed the hollow. Some even sought it out. A commune from New Orleans claimed to have found the fields in 1968. Days later, a local paper reported a mass death near the Red River. 12 young men and women, their bodies intact but completely drained of fat. Their skin sagged loose, as if worn by something else before being discarded. Authorities ruled it a poisoning, but the coroner privately told his assistant, "I don't know what I cut open. They weren't people anymore." Saint Froid remained off-limits, a shadow on official charts. But travelers still reported hearing children's songs drifting across the cane fields. Even when no town stood there anymore, the hollow had outlived the town. It was moving with the century. By the 20th century's end, the hollow was no longer bound to one plantation, one orphanage, or one chapel. It had become an inheritance. Its symbols appeared in unlikely places, etched into church rafters in Mississippi, hidden in the wood grain of pews in Georgia, scrawled on asylum walls in Alabama. A contagion of memory. Survivors of hollow fields were long dead, yet their children and grandchildren spoke of nightmares where their skin was unzipped like coats and traded among strangers. One folklorist wrote in 1982, "The hollow is not an event. It is a structure. It feeds on silence, on institutions that cover its hunger. Plantation, an orphanage, a church, a town. America itself is the hollow wearing its Sunday skin." His book was never published. He hanged himself in his study before it could go to print.